Hello and welcome to American Motherhood, where we're making civic engagement more accessible for busy moms. I'm Bethany, and Haley is joining me today as co-host. We're two millennial moms from Central Ohio asking questions, seeking answers, and learning right alongside you. As we continue to watch the division in this country grow, we wanted to find someone who could speak honestly about bipartisanship. Someone with real insight into what could actually bring families together across the political aisle. So we sat down with Senator Blessing, a Republican member of the Ohio Senate representing the 8th District. We talk about how bipartisanship has changed, how much collaboration actually happens behind the scenes at the Ohio Statehouse, and how becoming a father shaped the way Senator Blessing approaches family policy. We also talk about the issues Ohio families are raising and what he'd say to parents who feel discouraged by politics but still want to make a difference. And that really gets to the heart of American motherhood, exploring how society and politics shape the motherhood experience so that we can have an informed vote. One quick term you'll hear throughout this episode is the General Assembly, which is simply Ohio's state legislature made up of the 99-member House of Representatives and 33-member state Senate. A new General Assembly begins every 2 years after the even year elections. Last but not least, we have until October 5th to register to vote in this November's election. But don't wait until the deadline. Check your registration now. And if you plan to vote absentee, request your ballot early. We are now required in Ohio to have absentee ballots returned by 7:30 p.m. on Election Day. Okay, let's dive in. Senator Blessing, thank you for joining us today. You said yes right away to our invitation, and we're so excited to speak with you. Before we get political, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what inspired you to get involved in public service, and what keeps you motivated after doing this work for more than a decade?
Yeah, so it's been an odd journey for me. In the political world, you see a lot of folks come at it with a lot of name ID if they have, a family name. And I will be the first to admit that that would be me, coming from a position where my dad was in the legislature for 30 years, 1983 to 2012. We have the same name. I'm the third. He's junior. And, I had helped him with his campaigns and whatnot growing up. It's always been there. I was born in 1980. And at the time, he was a township trustee. So I've never known a time where either he nor I was in politics, or not in politics, I should say. So the opportunity presented itself to run in 2012. And of course, I went for it. I'm an engineer by trade, obviously, but that has been not so useful for this line of work. Although the number crunching is kind of good for it. But no, and originally I started as more of cut taxes kind of guy and, very much like a traditional Republican. But I don't know if this was the critical moment. My oldest was born premature, 31 weeks and 6 days. Because 32 weeks would be that point where they feel confident, okay, you're good. And he spent the first 7 or 8 months in the NICU from July of 2016 to March of 17 due to lung development. And then between that and the massive cost of childcare on top of it, you definitely see things from a different perspective. And that's when, it started to dawn on me. And we're not, neither my wife nor I are poor. If she's an attorney, I'm an engineer, we do well. But we found this to be incredibly expensive and difficult, even in our position. And that really changed my thinking, okay, what about those people who are not in such a position? And we're older parents. What if people are parents in their early 20s? It would be a colossal struggle, I would think, for most folks. And that has changed my thinking. That has kept me going. It's reflected in a lot of legislation that I've been supporting over the past 5-6 years. I guess there's before the pandemic and after the pandemic in many respects. I'm siding loosely with my Senate career, but a lot of it is reflected in that. And I think one of the big ones that I'm trying to approach now, and people will push back well, can we do this? Can we do that? But I don't care what people think about the concept of universal childcare. I'm 100% in favor of that as a massive public good. We have something similar in many respects with K through 12 education. Why is K through 12 education okay? But if we were to extend that all the way to the point of birth or whenever parents want to, put their children in that system, why would that suddenly be considered socialism? And the answer is it's nonsense. It's a public good, and it would be a tremendous benefit, not just for Ohio but for the country at large.
Oh gosh, well, we love to hear you say that. That is definitely something that would benefit, to your point, all Ohioans. So that will be an exciting day if we can get there.
Well, starts with introduction. So
yeah.
Well, it's a very interesting perspective, and it's nice to hear that position from somebody with your party affiliation, because that's something that we don't often hear. Now, obviously, as you mentioned, you became a father after you had already entered public office. Now, besides this specific experience with the NICU and your son's birth, are there other ways that being a dad has impacted you as a legislator?
Yeah. I mean, it's obviously with my challenges with my son, which if you saw him today, you'd be like, there's nothing wrong with him other than you might see the little G-tube scar in his stomach. But, other than that, it obviously changed my thinking with respect to childcare and healthcare. We were actually on Medicaid for a little bit there, given how long we were in the hospital with that. But, I'm part of what most people will deal with being the sandwich generation and having elderly parents. And, a lot of my thinking early on is very similar to conservative and libertarian thinking, which was, this is a very individualistic, you pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And, the reality is we are very communitarian. And, you look at young children, childcare and things like that. The same concept applies to people in their 80s and 90s. You can't expect them to get their jobs and work and do all this. These are people that need to be taken care of. And maybe that libertarian ethos is really deeply flawed at its core. So besides seeing my kids, besides seeing my aging parents, also seeing people that have severe learning disabilities, what do we do about those people? And so, a truly civil society has to take care of those people. And it's tough because getting into that kind of policy is politically thorny, and there's lots of, is that going too far? Is this enough? I get it. But I do know what we shouldn't be, and that would be just letting the elderly fend for themselves, letting the disabled fend for themselves. It's just not where we should be.
Well, we agree with you wholeheartedly there, and we're encouraged to hear you say that, and to hear, the possibility for a different future for Ohio, right? You have developed and clearly are already showcasing a reputation as somebody who is approachable and willing to work with members of both parties. Was that intentional, or did that just develop naturally over time?
It's always been there. In fits and starts. I do find that working across the aisle is extremely helpful in that if you pass legislation that way, it's, for lack of a better phrase, stickier. It's more likely to remain in code because, look, it passed with bipartisan support. But I kind of take a different tack that it's like, well, great if I can get some bipartisanship with this, but I'm more about trying to stake my own path on something like this. If I think it's a great idea, I'm not really concerned what a poll may show about something like this, or who in whatever leadership position might get upset with it. There has to be some sort of push to get that sort of thing done. Otherwise, everybody's just jockeying for different political positions and too afraid to stake out something that's, maybe very contrarian, but would also be tremendously popular policy.
Well, and I think we also find ourselves in this trap, right? We can't be effective. We can't be productive if you're only answering to the loudest voices on one side of the aisle. So again, very refreshing to hear. So from our perspective, it does seem like Republicans and Democrats rarely work together. Is that really what you experience day to day, or is there more collaboration happening behind the scenes?
There is more collaboration behind the scenes than I think people give it credit for. But in my opinion, not nearly enough. And it's, I guess my biggest concern with the political world now is that it really feels like you have 10, 15, 20 people at the state level calling the shots behind closed doors, and then what you see in committee and what you see on the floor is largely, I don't want to call it theater, but it's preordained, where people are like, well, there's going to be a vote, something's going to happen. It's like, well, it wouldn't be coming to the floor if it weren't, guaranteed to pass. Same thing with committee on this. And it also seems to align with what do big donors want to do. And everybody says, well, this doesn't influence our decisions. And I'm like, okay. Well, I've seen time and time again where it's somebody's a big donor and then 6 months later something occurs that greatly benefits them. I mean, it could be a coincidence if it's a one-off, but it happens often enough where, is it technically possible to flip a coin and get heads 50 times in a row? Sure. Mathematically, that's possible. Mm-hmm. But anybody that would experience that would be well within their right to start examining the coin for something untoward. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the bigger part of this, that, a lot, I've heard it from conservative and progressive elected officials as well, that there's really not a lot of people looking out for the taxpayer.
Where do you find there to be the most common ground between Republicans and Democrats? And what core values do you believe the parties share?
Good question. Boy, here I am talking about all this bipartisanship, and I'm trying to think where they come together on certain things. I mean, if it's a time of crisis, I've seen that come together. I mean, we kind of came together to some degree during COVID. And then after that, of course, when people found that they could, do things for political gain, that kind of fell apart. But in times of crisis, that it does happen. It happened with the Norfolk Southern derailment up there, in East Palestine. Happened with that in Cincinnati with the railroad sale, same company. And even during the budget, there are times where if Republicans are, if there's a few holdouts that don't want to do something and the Democrats do, and they're willing to offer their votes for something, you might see something that they can both agree on and in support of. But on the big things, I'm just not seeing there, be a lot of it right now. I mean, it's like public education to me should be a simple, nonpartisan, no-brainer. I've often joked that these folks, the public education folks, particularly teachers, should be in the same realm as like firefighters, where it's like, everybody respects them so much that, they might turn up for a picnic or something to let people know that they're still politically active. But the consensus is such, and they're so well respected that, it's unthinkable to do things. You don't see that. It seems like so much has been weaponized. So I know that's probably not giving you a good answer. I know this is going to dawn on me at some point in another question, but not on the big things. We'll leave it to.
Well, and that is what we're expecting. But, I think it's just a matter of, we have to address it. We have to acknowledge it if we're going to move forward, right? We have to acknowledge where we are right now. So what qualities make someone a productive partner in the State House, regardless of political affiliation?
Well, certainly if they're committee chairs or members of leadership, it's helpful to be, a very popular, well-liked person. I'll give you a good example of that in Senator George Lang, Senator Teresa Gavarone, Senator Herschel Craig, two Republicans and then a Democrat. They're just universally congenial people. You never see them crotchety or crabby, in stark contrast to me, where I'm oftentimes crotchety and crabby with things. People like that, and they're all in leadership. They have, they will be effective, although admittedly the Republican members more so. In particular, George Lang, where there have been bills that I've been on the fence over, and I'm like, it's hard to vote against this guy who's always so very positive, even when I'm very hypercritical of legislation he may have introduced. Those are the people that are the most effective. Thing is, though, I felt like, yes, they're effective, but there are a lot of limitations that they have. I've kind of found that even if you work with, the right people in both chambers with the administration, it is an incredible struggle to get something truly transformative through. It never happens. It hasn't really happened as far as I'm concerned. And no, I don't consider getting to a flat tax truly transformative, even though some people have viewed it that way. Which leads me to, I guess, another thing that I was going to kind of fuss about here, that like in terms of legislators and trying to be effective and get things done, you have like kind of two paths. You can be a prodigious fundraiser that toes the line and is able to, effectuate party policy that may not be broadly popular, or you can be a true dyed-in-the-wool reformer who is much more independent-minded, that introduces things that may be broadly popular, but you cannot be both. You cannot be both of those types of legislators. It's effectively impossible. And if somebody shows me a good example of that, I'll be the first one to say, I can tell you why that's not really true. They fall into one or the other camp. But again, working with members of leadership, committee chairs, the administration, that's the key to getting most things done. But truly transformative things, these days I'm taking the tack that you kind of need to go to the ballot.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, Senator Blessing, what advice would you have to new legislators who will be elected this fall?
Well, I mean, it's hard because you got your term limits. At best, you could have 8 years. Anybody who thinks, unless they are, red shirt freshmen in the sense that they have previous experience in the legislature, it's very difficult for members, especially new ones, to really understand the mechanics of how the legislature works. It's usually better to listen first and try to stake out an area of expertise. And you might find, for example, on the Republican side, there's going to be no shortage of members that want to get into the social issues. You might find on the Democrat side, there's no shortage of members that might want to get involved in union issues. But to become an expert on property taxation, for example, public education, Medicaid, it would be a better use of a new legislator's time to become an expert in one of those areas and really spend some time learning it, not just today's policy, but the history of why certain decisions were made, political or otherwise, to be more effective in that space. And I've seen that those sorts of legislators always tend to do well because they're needed. They're indispensable. I mean, I can count on one hand the number of members that really could explain in some decent detail how the school funding formula works, or how property taxes work, or how Medicaid works, or even how, various tax policy issues work. That would be my best advice. But, also to pick issues that, other folks might not be interested in attempting, that are high profile. There's always the, getting your name out there and being visible. But if you can pick a very, I will call it, classical progressive issue that really is trying to move the ball forward, that's very visible and gets people talking, that's a worthwhile issue. Now, a good example of that is, for me, with the expanding the size of the legislature, where there were a few reporters that are like, what in God's name is this? And asked me about it. And I'm like, don't think that there's not a long history behind something like this, that Ohio isn't out of step with the rest of the country. And they're like, oh my God, this really is worth reporting. And there was a number of people talking about it. Even conservative folks back home were like, yeah, this is unfair. We're tired of getting beat by money folks, either in DC or Columbus. Yeah, if you had smaller districts, we'd have a better shot at winning. And Democrats had said the same thing. And it turned into this big brouhaha. If you can find an issue like that, I would encourage members to be, more courageous. There are plenty of issues like that they can hop into, and they're never going, in my opinion at least, never going to pay a political price for that. If anything, it is going to raise their profile.
So interesting.
So has there ever been an issue that you worked on where you were working across the aisle that did cost you politically, either with other senators in your party or with your constituents?
I mean, nothing that I've really gotten just blasted over in emails and phone calls and things like that. Usually that's, taking a certain vote, but working across the aisle on a particular bill, well, okay. Here's a good one. Working with Senator Antonio. It was the one where I went after the institutional housing investors, the large, the Blackstones in Cincinnati, in the Cincinnati area, Columbus even, where they were buying up all these single family homes. And the legislation simply sought to say, look, if you own more than 50 of these single family homes in a county, you're going to be taxed heavily. The idea is that anything beyond 50 was going to force you to sell because you were very monopolistic in your financializing something that is absolutely a necessity for people in housing. And it didn't affect apartments or anything like that. Well, obviously, real estate investors went ballistic with that, many of whom are Republicans. I'm not really surprised at that. And they, were like, we're going to vote you out. This is the worst thing ever. How dare you call yourself a Republican? I had even one email say you are a disgrace to your office. But I knew I was right on this because I had a number of Republicans who had, interestingly enough, children who were college age and coming out of college who were trying to buy a home and were unable to do so. And these folks told me, they're like, look, we agree with you. Our children and even us are keenly aware of what's going on. It is bad. We used to be the party that fought monopolies. We're with you on this. And I bring this up because it's funny how something like that, the tables tend to turn, where Trump gets up there on Twitter and says, we need to go after the institutional housing investors. And then all of a sudden, my colleagues, some of these folks that were screaming at me were like, wow, what do you think about doing this? Maybe this is an option. And I'm like, really? I remember when I gave that testimony in March or April-ish of 2023 with Nikki Antonio, I felt every bit as proud of that bill then as I do now, but it was vindication to see that. And I think for legislators, I think if they, again, take those contrarian bets, they will be rewarded for it at some point. And that's not to say it's the only reason that I'm doing something like that.
Sure.
I just want to, improve my name ID and take a bunch of arrows in the meantime. I legitimately believe it to be good policy. There were plenty of people that were for it. I wasn't doing anything because I thought, it was going to score political points. Now, that's actually the difference. If you can do bills like that will, score you political points with, certain demographics or whatnot, but they're usually nakedly transparent, where people see that and they're like, you don't have a compelling case for why you're doing that other than to stick your thumb in somebody's eye. We're not buying that. But on the housing thing, it was like, if you're trying to stick a thumb in the eye of the real estate investors for something that's broadly popular and needed, it's a funny way of going about it. No, actually, we'll take you at your word. We'll support you on that. It's been like that in a number of cases. Even people that have pushed back and have been like, oh, he's doing that for political. What does he care about, XYZ group? The cash bill was like that. I don't know if you guys followed Ohio politics. That was my first, I would say, really big contrarian bill. Was a bill to simply mandate acceptance of cash at retail establishments because I had issues with privacy. Look, if you want to use cash, you don't want to be tracked. There was a gentleman in England, I would say he's European, and those folks tend to travel all over the place like it's no big deal versus me who stays in Cincinnati, but had written about how this is such a major problem. And, I introduced that bill. And I remember at the time, Michael Ruley was the chairman, and he's like, what? And he's like, wait a minute, it's legal tender. I'm like, it is. For all debts, public and private. If you don't have a debt, they can force you to use a credit card. He's like, well, what? We need to fix this. This is terrible. And I think the business community thought, well, we oppose this because we want to be able to do what we want in this space. And if we want to make it only electronic, it's only electronic. Well, missed the backlash on that, because then there were a lot of members of my party who were like, no, we should have more hearings on this. It turned into this big brouhaha. A lot of bills only will have one hearing and then they go away. Well, this got a proponent testimony because the chairman felt very strongly about it. And then we've introduced, now, admittedly, we haven't gotten it done, but every GA since then, I've introduced it. But since then, somebody in the other chamber, Rep. David Thomas, who we fought tooth and nail over property tax philosophy and things like that, has introduced a bill in this space. Senator Fetterman on the Democrat side wanted to do this in Congress. Warren Davidson, I think, was going to do something in this space. It really just sort of exploded. And a number of states have done exactly this with massive bipartisan support. And I think these are the sorts of things that, you can get beat up by very powerful interests, but then you often see a lot of the courage is infectious behavior where other members are like, wait a minute, I'm not going to pass this up. I don't care what these guys think. This is the right thing to do, and we're going to do it. And it's been both sides of the aisle in both cases. The cash bill, the Democrats came out in mass to say, yeah, why wouldn't we want to do this? I mean, and it just goes to show you how powerful these things can be, as when you have this wall of popular support on both sides of the aisle, it really just feels like a matter of time before these things get done.
Very interesting.
Now, so leadership oftentimes means not getting everything that you want, which I think our audience of mothers can relate to pretty easily. So what does leadership look like when you're unable to get everything you want? And how do you know when compromise strengthens a solution rather than weakens it?
Great question. And if I saw opportunities for what I consider to be real compromise, I think you'd see a lot more of it from me. What compromise tends to mean in the General Assembly is you're going to vote for this big package of reforms that you may find terrible. And, you might get a study committee out of it. And to my way of thinking, I'm like, that is a really expensive proposition, and I don't want to do that. A good example of compromise was the license registration legislation that I did with Catherine Ingram that basically sought to make it so that, you're not going to go into piles of debt if you drove without registration, which obviously you want to do that for good reason. But some of these people are, so poor they don't have two nickels to rub together. And it just became this ratcheting system of penalties that they could never get themselves out of. And of course, if you can't drive, you really can't participate in the economy the same way that you could in a city with, a more viable system of public transportation. But there were back and forth discussions with prosecutors. Okay, we can give on this, we can give on that. Okay, that's a novel way of thinking about things. And we did ultimately get it across the finish line. That was a good compromise. Would also be willing to do legitimate compromise in the sense that, one camp gets a really big transformative policy change and the other camp gets that. And there's that whole concept, the grand bargain in politics is dead and gone, but I really hope it comes back. And what I'm getting at for something like this is, suppose Ohio wanted to get, we're at a flat 2.75% income tax now. What if they wanted to get to 2%? There'd be a lot of screaming and gnashing of teeth because that's a lot of revenue that could go to public education, Medicaid, childcare, whatever. Rather than ram it through in a budget, if they were to come to me and I were king for the day and they were to say, look, if you vote for this 2% income tax cut or to get to flat 2%, but we're willing to increase the tobacco tax as DeWine wanted to do for the child care tax credit, we're willing to hike a little bit higher the marijuana tax, go after sports betting taxes again, all of this to pay for the entirety of the fair school funding formula plus inputs, which I hate to be, so snarky about that because everybody's like, we did the formula. I'm like, you didn't. You didn't increase the inputs. That is not the formula. Stop with the nonsense. But that that would almost certainly have me as saying that is a compromise I'm willing to entertain. If you can, not only pay for those tax cuts, but also deal with the public goods as well. Yes, I'm willing to do that. And I think you'd find a lot of moderate members and even Democrats would say the same thing. They'd be like, sure, you give us that, we'd have a unanimous vote on the budget. Imagine that. It's happened before. I don't see any reason why it shouldn't happen again. It would be really nice to be able to do that regularly. But that, to me, compromise needs to be a lot more balanced than the way it is today in the General Assembly and certainly Congress, where they don't seem to do anything at this point. I've got my thoughts on why that is, but you'd probably be here till 6 at night. So
well, we'll have to do this again sometime.
More than happy to do it.
So if lawmakers from both parties were to decide today to tackle one issue affecting Ohio families, where do you think the greatest potential for bipartisan agreement exists?
Bipartisan agreement. I would say there's two areas. I would say the first one is certainly with public education. There are a number of Republican legislators that represent rural areas who view the voucher system. And look, I'm Catholic. My kids go to Catholic schools. I will admit all that. But, you do need a strong public education system. It's in the Constitution. We take an oath of office to defend exactly that. And there aren't these school choice options in rural areas the same way. And so properly funding our schools at the state level is a huge winner for a whole host of reasons that if you ever look at a lot of my press releases, I go into detail why, school funding actually is property tax relief for a lot of families using the state's economy of scale. And it's spectacular. And frankly, there were something like 80 plus co-sponsors on the original Cup-Patterson formula back in, oh my God, when was that? 2018 or 19, something like that. Mm-hmm. I think at some point that is going to happen because the property tax relief, if you call it that we did, really wasn't that. There were some pieces that did provide real relief, but most of it was just shifting local dollars around. Something like this, at some point, the General Assembly is going to have to get around to doing that. Just out of, if not for any other reason, but for, it's becoming too much of an issue that you can't ignore it anymore. And again, there are a number of Republican legislators, present company included, who want to see it done, put to rest. And I've asked the public ed folks repeatedly, if you got the entirety of the fair school funding formula, would you consider it done, kaput, on the funding side? And the vast majority of them are like, oh yeah, of course. That would be such an enormous weight off of our shoulders. You probably wouldn't see us but for ancillary issues for some time. And that's great. So I do think that's probably the biggest area. The second biggest area is with respect to childcare. And I think it's a different dynamic in the sense that there may be fewer Republicans on board for that. The way that we do publicly funded childcare in Ohio is abysmal compared to other states. I mean, it's not even worth comparing. We're that bad. But, this is something that Democrats have always supported. There's a growing number of Republicans, particularly ones that skew younger. And the business community is starting to realize, oh my God, if we want to keep more people in the workforce and increase real wages, then yes, we are behind this wholeheartedly. That's the dynamic that's not there for public education in the sense that you don't see the business community coming out. I mean, they do, but not to the same extent for public schools the way that they are for childcare. Mm-hmm. Now, what I think or at least what I'm hoping occurs is some of the younger generations realize, to live in this country, to live in Ohio, you have some enormously big expenses. It's not just housing, but it's also childcare. It's also student debt, to a lesser degree, your utilities and things like that. But if you can wipe out one of those things in childcare with the state's economy of scale, which, by the way, universal childcare, if you did this, if you just simply had it like healthcare, like the pitch at the federal level for public option healthcare, if you simply had the public school system as such to say, look, if you guys take the money, you provide, universal childcare through your model, I mean, we're talking about maybe another billion or two. People be like, oh, that sounds like a big number. I'm like, really, it's not. We just did an almost $2 billion income tax cut. Surely we can do that. The thing is, you talk about a tax cut for middle class families that you would not have to pay for childcare. I mean, it's. I remember just laughing at the flexible spending account that we had. I'm like, $5,000 and whatever. We're gonna eat through that in a couple months. But to have this as a public good, now you suddenly have women in particular able to stay in the workforce. I try to tell people not to take this the wrong way, but wages for a lot of these families could actually remain stagnant, but their real wages would be significantly higher. I mean, you ask pretty much any employee, what would you rather have if you have like two young kids, free childcare or another $2 to $3 on your hourly wage? I think unless they are out of their mind, they would prefer the universal childcare as an option. And that's the whole idea, that your real wages, even though your nominal wage may be lower, the fact that you do not have to pay childcare means that your real wage is significantly higher. Business community understands that. And frankly, the economics community has broadly understood this for a long time. People whose entire careers are devoted to studying the economy and trying to optimize it are saying this as well. I think you will see in time the situation on that flip as we move away from such a very doctrinaire libertarian attitude in the General Assembly to a more, hey, wait a minute, this is tremendous economics. Why wouldn't we want to do this? And we could do this with massive bipartisan support. The same way that you look at, and I'm not that I would normally point to Arkansas as an example, it's the same concept with universal free breakfast, which, I got some criticism for. But again, as a parent, if you don't have to ever worry about your child having breakfast, making them breakfast in the morning, you just shoo them out the door. That's a lot of money saved.
And time.
And time. Right. You can get them up later. But the thing is it all accrues to a family's benefit, and how that money's going to be spent. It's not like most families are going to be like, I'm going to buy 20 pounds of silver and store it in a vault. No, you're going to spend that money, and it's going to generate sales tax revenue. It's going to generate economic activity. I mean, and I think, at least having studied this, I know that at least that thinking is correct. And I just think it's a matter of time before the General Assembly follows suit and says, yep, this is a good one, not just for economic reasons, not just for moral reasons, but frankly, even political reasons, where there are a number of families out there that are like, we may have voted Republican forever, but we're not exactly thrilled what they're doing, or not doing, I should say, for families.
Now, on the flip side, are there any issues where meaningful compromise between the parties just isn't realistic? Is there anything different about those issues than these, which really seem to be family-centered? So I'm not sure if other issues maybe would not align with family values.
It's a tough dynamic to talk about. I mean, certainly some of the social issues, I don't think you're going to see, some compromise on going forward. I think the best that can be hoped for in many respects is like, let's just let this one, lie and not really, try to fight this one out. But in terms of economic issues, I mean, I would have said healthcare was one of those issues. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the big battle over, the Affordable Care Act and how if you supported anything like that, well, then you were just a socialist. Even though, more people age and the more that they start feeling their bodies break down, we're like, wait a minute, I'm again going to be a lot less rigid in my views and something like that, particularly when you have something like Medicare, which is literally, free healthcare for seniors at this point. And I think in time there will be a better balance in something like that. But right now it doesn't feel like there's going to be great compromise there. That's where the political arena comes into play, where politicians will get out there and say, "This is my vision for the future. This is where I want to see us going." And I mean, obviously, negative campaigning certainly moves the needle more than positive campaigning. But thing is, though, people are definitely feeling inflation, affordability issues, your kitchen table issues. I don't know that trying to skirt around some of these issues with rhetoric is really going to work the way that it did the past 10 to 20 years. And frankly, parties do evolve. You look at some of these folks that used to be the Republicans of the early 20th and late 19th century. You'd be like, my God, that platform, that politician, really? Robert La Follette, a Wisconsin senator, is one. You should look him up. They have a festival for him that if you can believe it, Bernie Sanders goes to visit. And he was a member of the Republican Party. So was Louis Brandeis, famous Supreme Court justice. But even Teddy Roosevelt on Mount Rushmore, and a well-respected Republican leader, very much was in favor of these concepts of social insurance in a way that I could see the Republican Party moving towards. Because right now, if you look at where the party is, for example, with tax cuts and economic libertarianism and all that sort of jazz, it's been the case for the past 40 or 50 years. That was also sort of melded together with social conservatism. And the observation that I've had over the past 10 years is that really a stable coalition? When you think about, pro-life issues, pro-family issues, I don't know. It seems to me that they're not really in sync as they are today. And I think there's going to be a schism at some point, which frankly you've seen with the rise of Trump and a lot of those folks that are in the MAGA crowd. I wouldn't call them doctrinaire conservatives in any sense of the word. Many of them are social conservatives, and if you ask them about more economic policies, they tend to skew more progressive. So it could be a very interesting time over these next 10 years, as sort of the parties having been frozen in amber see some more dynamism than we've seen in decades.
So I'm curious, as we're talking, if Republicans hold the supermajority going into next year, but Dr. Acton gets elected as governor, what role does the governor play in a lot of these decisions, and what impact do you think that could have, in terms of what we've been talking about today?
So, the governor obviously introduces their budget. Admittedly, it'll have the House Finance Chairman's name on it. They introduce it. Obviously, whether it's Republican or Democrat, it gets a major overhaul before it passes out of the House, and certainly before it makes it to the governor's desk. Now, I wouldn't immediately say, "That's your daughter there."
You can keep going. I will listen.
Okay. No, I was going to say, you see governors of both parties get pushback even within their own party. I think that dynamic would continue. I think to think about what would happen, it's probably best to study what happened 2007 to 2010 when Strickland was governor, and you had a Republican Senate, and then for half of that time, Republican House, and then a Democrat House. How did they then work things out? So there will be things that, a Governor Ramaswamy or a Governor Acton will want that the General Assembly will maybe not want. And I'm not naive enough to think that it's even on both sides. If it's Governor Acton, there will be a lot of things that she will want to do that maybe the Republican General Assembly will not want to do. And I do say, without just looking at the numbers, it would be really difficult for the Dems to take either chamber. And I would imagine that, I vaguely recall reading an article about this, that, it's pretty likely that the Senate will maintain a supermajority. And I wouldn't dispute that. But the thing is that, the governor can veto quite a bit. That will matter greatly. So the question is, for the Republican Party to get what it wants through what is arguably the largest policy statement of the year, which is the operating budget. What is it willing to concede on going forward? And the supermajority question is an important one because let's say instead of 65 seats, we went down to 59, or hey, even 60 or 61, enough to technically override a veto. Mm-hmm. I don't know that it's always going to be easy if that situation were to occur for rank and file Republicans after a year that would have been largely seen as a loss to say we're just going to override unflinchingly everything. I think there would be a lot more give and take than there is today under a unified system. Now, it could also go the opposite direction. If Ramaswamy wins and he does as he's saying he wants to do on the campaign trail, and the income tax, do a big cut to the property tax system. But either way, the question is what is going to be given up in order to effectuate that. I wouldn't take it as a given that Republicans would say, sure, we're going to give you everything you want, for the same reasons that DeWine and Kasich, and I'm sure Taft at one point, never got everything that they want. I mean, and for good reason. You would hope that the legislature would assert its role the same way that the executive asserts their role. Mm-hmm. So I really have no idea, where this could go or even speculate, because frankly, these folks haven't been super forthright with, the details of their platform. But I mean, that's campaign world. You mean I'm not surprised in the slightest that you're seeing this. Nobody gets out there and gives a 20 bullet point list of planks that they're going to put in their childcare bill. I mean, it's not going to sell the same way that a 10-word slogan might.
Right. Yeah. Oh, that's great. Okay. So bringing this back a little bit, why should Ohio families care whether lawmakers work across party lines and work to compromise, as we've been talking about?
Because you could have so much. I mean, I think people, and I understand it. It's very difficult to pay attention to what's going on in Columbus or what's going on in Congress. You definitely feel like there's a degree of loss of agency. Like, well, who am I to make any change at all? Why should I care? And a lot of people are, busy with their own lives, just wanting to get by. But I mean, some of these public goods that, people might take for granted, like we'll say Social Security, for example, that hasn't always been the case. Mm-hmm. A lot of these things like that are Depression era or Great Society era ideas that have been around for at best 100 years, and you have to fight for these sorts of things, and you can have them. I mean, it's to me, when you look at something like childcare, like it's something that, like, if you think about it, really, you're only a handful of senators and representatives and a governor's signature away from literally having something just like that. And I know it can seem tantalizingly close, and I'm making it sound like it's easy, but none of this occurs if people are just like, well, I'm going to sit, it'll never happen, so I'm not even going to try. I see that same dynamic with legislation where legislators are, take a cynical view of, well, I don't think that has a chance of passing, so I'm not even going to try. And I'm like, well, you're actually paid to make the attempt. These things. And if your attitude is to say, well, I'm going to do what leadership only what leadership wants me to do, or the administration, or my congressman, or one or two powerful people home, you're not really representing your district very well if you're doing that. But to actually accomplish something, I mean, it would be extraordinary. And I think people miss sometimes just how much agency they actually have. It doesn't really, I mean, how many people, my wife is not like this. She's much better than me, but 9:00 rolls around and, I get my phone out and I'm not doom scrolling, but reading and, but would it really be so difficult in that period of time to just write a simple paragraph or two saying, hey, look, I'm a Republican, but I support this idea that might be considered a more Democrat leaning idea, and vice versa. It's not that difficult to do something like that. You're not going to be arrested. You're not going, there's not going to be some horrible thing that happens to you for that. But most people never do that. And I think it can also be very cathartic in many respects to do something like that and get it out to say, look, I've done more than just my part. I've done more than vote. I've actually advocated. But I'll tell you, not many folks, show up at a lot of these public forums I've seen. It might seem like a lot to a new legislator to see, wow, there's a room of 60 people. But if it's on property taxes, I mean, you would think there would be hundreds of people, particularly for myself or some other folks who are literally in the room, who have chaired study committees for that, who have chaired committees that have dealt with that exact issue. But, I don't know. I think a lot of times people just give up, and that's a problem. I do have a roundabout solution for that, but...
Well, Senator Blessing, that's my next question. Is what changes can we make, do you think, that would make a real difference in the way that our lawmakers work together?
So this dynamic, and this is not something that is a new crazy idea. The Constitutional Modernization Commission had a similar idea. But I tell people to look at Senate Joint Resolution 2. Now, that's mine, and I call that the off-ramp amendment. SJR 2 would be very simple in the sense that it would cut the number of signatures in half for initiated statute, which there's a difference between putting something in the Constitution versus statute. Issue 2, the marijuana issue, went into statute. The abortion amendment, of course, went into the Constitution. So what the difference here is that statute can be amended later. But cutting that signature threshold in half, because remember, contrary to popular belief, it is very difficult to get something on the ballot. Should it pass, then there is a 2-year period where a supermajority, 60% in the House and the Senate, is needed to amend any part of what was passed at the ballot. The idea being that it gives a law a chance to actually work, or if you need to amend it immediately, you're going to have to draw bipartisan support for something like that. And it encourages more citizen engagement in the sense, wow, we can really go to the ballot and get this on there, but it doesn't have to go in the Constitution to stick for a period of time. No, we're going to choose this. I think it would cut down on constitutional amendments just because it's easier to do this. It sends a message to the General Assembly, and the default in a situation like this. So the General Assembly's default is, well, we don't have to act. In a situation like this, that inaction suddenly is flipped. The inaction becomes a virtue. And if they are going to change something that they don't like, they're probably going to have to go to the minority party to get some degree of support to change it, which is exactly what you want. And it breaks sort of the moneyed interests that, block this or block that or push this or push that. That would give a lot more agency to people who have no such hang up. For them, $600 million to a Cleveland sports team is an egregious offense, and no amount of lobbying is going to change their mind on something like that if that were to go to the ballot. That, I think, would get people more publicly engaged. Same thing with the primary system, open primaries, the idea that, you can't just be a narrow subset of Republicans or Democrats. The primaries are now open to independents, which, by the way, are the largest party in Ohio by a country mile. Now they suddenly have more agency to pick the candidates they want. They could go down that list instead of today saying, well, you got to pick only Republicans or pick only Democrats. Mm-hmm. Or if you're an independent, you can't pick any of them in a primary. Now you got a menu of options. You could say, well, I don't really care about the presidential race, but I do care about U.S. Senate. I do care about Congress, and they could split it any which way they wanted to. That is real liberty. And I think it would change a lot of how the General Assembly and Congress are made up. So there are reforms out there. I'm just hoping that I get more people to support these things. And if the
Yeah.
cash bill and the institutional housing investors and some of these other ideas are any indication, I think there will be people on both sides of the aisle that will pick up on this. And, 5, 10, 20 years after I'm gone, I wouldn't be surprised to see some of these ideas getting across the finish line in a way that I couldn't hope to have happen in, my time in office.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious if my perception of this, if you agree with this, that to be operating in more of a bipartisan manner generally tends to mean that you are being more true to the people rather than the party. Do you think that that's accurate, the way that I'm seeing that? It just seems like these bipartisan actions are really concerned about what is best for the people as a whole, which makes sense. We're not looking at getting one party across the line there.
I mean, not always. I mean, they can parties can do pretty bad things together.
Okay. Yeah.
A notable example of that is, when we were dealing with minor political parties, which, I mean, you guys would be like, well, of course, if Republicans and Democrats, the Republicans are like, well, we don't like you and you don't like us, but neither of us likes the Libertarians or the Greens. So we'll pass a minor political party bill to make it more difficult for them. Yes, they can gang up on interests like that. I mean, in many respects, you saw it with ranked choice voting. Now, admittedly, the Dems were conflicted at first, and I think all but Senator DeMora ultimately voted against it. But that was another one of those situations where it was balancing party interests versus what is actually designed to sort of bring people more to the political center. But like I said, bipartisanship for bipartisanship's sake is not always good. I mean, I've seen it, where, besides that, there have been economic issues. I'm trying to think on the tip of my tongue where I've seen it occur where I'm like, that's not good. But they're both in on it. Mm-hmm. But it can happen. But broadly speaking, if you've got some bipartisan support on some things, chances are it's better than not. I will say that versus, a party line vote.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So what role can voters play in creating incentives for elected officials to work together? Obviously, we have our vote, and that's very important. And, our aim is to encourage our audience to get more involved, as we've been talking about, reach out to your representatives. Yeah. But is there anything else that we can do that you can think of?
I mean, it's hard because, I don't know, there are some structural things that I think need to be addressed that I guess what I like, the first thought that popped into my head was, the number of people I've heard on both sides of the aisle that are like, well, yeah, I really think that person is objectively terrible and corrupt and awful, but I'm still going to vote for him because I can't imagine voting for the other party. And it's like, okay, that's the attitude that ensures you're going to get more of that, people playing to their camps. And I remember seeing some graphics years ago where you had the parties in 1983 versus I think it was 2014. And, in 1983, you had a number of Republicans that were more progressive than Democrats and plenty of Democrats that were more conservative than Republicans. You don't see that anymore. They've all been swept to the edges. And I think it's made it where people have felt like, or particularly the politicians, that there's no incentive to really to be more bipartisan, to, try to figure out what the other side's voters want, because what are you going to get for it? They're still going to vote no, and you might alienate your own voters, even though morally speaking, that's really not a good way to be. And that's why I get to the structural issues like SJR2, expanding the size of the legislature, even looking at redistricting now in terms of like just focusing less on trying to create balance and just saying, look, both of you guys are going to muck this up if you if you're left to your own devices, as we've seen with like states like Illinois, where the League of Women Voters is like flipped. They're fighting the Dems over there. But if you're redistricting based solely on compact districts, it becomes a lot harder to draw them for partisan gain, because again, if you're drawing for partisan gain, they're going to have these big long perimeters, which can't happen with a compact map. So these are the sort of structural things that I think, if they occur, will really help matters. And again, open primaries. When you do that, I shouldn't say most, well, maybe most legislators are more afraid of their own base. So that as long as you can win the primary, chances are you're going to win the general. Mm-hmm. And it's that small subset of voters that, is basically going to crown you the victor. But in an open primary, you now have a vested incentive to go after independents and even Democrats for that primary in order to advance. And that, as I've told people, it's going to have this sort of gravitational pull towards the middle. You're trying to gain as much consensus and overall support as you can, rather than that same dynamic with a very small subset of your own party. Mm-hmm. So, and again, I tell people these are things that probably would have to go to the ballot, because I don't see the General Assembly changing anytime soon on that. If my committee testimony on any of these ideas has been any example of that. But it's been fun all the same putting it out there, because I haven't felt like they've been unreasonably hostile, but just I can see them smiling, but I can definitely see their internal mind's eye rolling. They're like, well, we don't want to get into it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, before we close, one final question for you. Many parents feel discouraged by today's political climate, but they still want to make a positive difference in our communities. What's one piece of advice you'd leave them with?
Well, as much as, people are kind of disgusted with political parties, you're going to have to, if you really want to move the needle and get to know people, you're going to have to join one. And, I get that people might say, I don't fall neatly into either bucket. Well, fine, but you can always go to, a Republican or a Democrat club and meet people there and listen to people speak and ask questions. You can frankly start your own advocacy, although I will tell you there is a lot of truth to hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. I've seen locally in Cincinnati, a group of women that were furious over, priest sex abuse, grooming, things like that. One of whom, it's not a big deal to name drop her, but Rebecca Surendorf led this group, and has been tireless over 10 years and has actually gotten bills signed into law for her advocacy, to the point where I asked her, I'm like, what were you doing? And she's like, well, I've gone to all these Democrat clubs. I've gone to all these Republican clubs. I've gone to literally every event that I could possibly do. And I'm just sitting here thinking about it, how realistic is that for an average person to do? You really have to be evangelized to do that. But I think people, miss sort of the impact that they can have locally. They can also run for office. Fun fact, there are a lot of situations where, a given village or city or whatever might have, 4 seats up and only 3 people file. And I tell people, I'm like, all you have to do is, get a few signatures, file the paperwork, pay the fee, and you're on the ballot, and you'll win because you're unopposed. But then once you're there, you get to see, inside how it works. You have a bully pulpit in many respects. There's a lot of things you can do to move the needle on this. And I've seen actually in recent times a lot of, moms of younger children running for office, which I think is a very good thing. In fact, we have one in the Senate right now with Senator Susan Manchester, who just recently gave birth within the past month. And so, I think that's a good thing, because I'm curious to see, she's a very cheery positive person, but she's also very, very conservative.
Mm.
But I'm interested to see how this dynamic changes. Will it change her to some degree, with her views with respect to childcare, to see, oh, this is how this works. This is why this is a problem. I am willing to bet that it does. And I think that some of these younger folks, particularly those with young children, should consider that, is even if it's difficult to do. I get it. But, now would be a good time, or at least if you can't do that, become active and speak up. Well, honestly, what would be nice is if some of these folks would speak at various, I don't know if it's like this for the Democrat clubs, but for the Republican clubs, oftentimes, you'll have somebody come in there and it's always the same or very similar viewpoints being pushed. And I'm like, I get it. You want to fraternize and you want to be around people that are like-minded, with their politics, but you should also want to be challenged. And you just don't see that. It's like I guess what I'm saying is we get caught up in our echo chambers many times. And I'm a perfect example. I was very much in an echo chamber and prior to having kids and whatnot. And it's when you're finally exposed to other things that you kind of reevaluate things. Right now, it doesn't seem like we're doing a lot of that.
I think what you said about the echo chambers really aligns with exactly what we're getting at here. People get stuck in their own party. They're not even willing to explore ideas that are proposed by the other party, even though it could be beneficial to them if they actually looked past the party affiliation and listened to, the substance there. So I think that's a big reason that we wanted to talk to you today, is because we really want our listeners to be able to evaluate things based on the merits and not just the party affiliation.
Sure.
People tend to just think, oh, well, the Republicans are going with that. I'm a Republican, so I'm going to go with that. It's like, well, you didn't even listen. They just go with it.
Well, to be fair, you do have a lot of campaign rhetoric that doesn't match reality. I mean, I've had colleagues on both sides of the aisle that, will tell me, oh, I'm a moderate. I take an independent approach to things. And I'm like, well, that's not really what your record suggests. Your record is such that you have literally voted with your own party every single opportunity you had to do that. Now, if that's what you really believe, that's fine. But don't tell us, or you really don't have a lot of ability to say that you're really independent minded on that. And I think that's part of the problem with, voters. I think a lot of times see that and they just immediately assume, well, if some sweet talking Republican or Democrat gets in there, they're just going to follow the party line. I'm going to be perpetually disappointed. And so it just has this self-reinforcing effect on that, which is one of the reasons why, these smaller legislative districts would have helped with that. It actually pulls money out of the system in the sense that now, the 10 to 20 bigwigs that, donate tons of money and call shots. It's one thing to try to influence 20, 30 people in terms of legislators, but what if you had a legislature the size of what a lot of pro-democracy reformers want, which would be the cube root of the population? So that would be a House of Representatives in Ohio of 229 members and 50,000 seat legislative seats. If you do that, suddenly the money is all divided in a way that, they can't increase, so it becomes more divided. And think of it this way. It's one thing to win a popularity contest with 300,000 people. It's 360,000 for Ohio Senate districts for what it's worth. But I mean, how about your own community, like your own church, or your own family? Your own family could, if you were a politician and you saw all these ads on the news trashing you, your family would know that is garbage because I personally know that person. So all these terrible negative ads would in many ways fall flat because people, frankly, they know their legislators. And they would be like, that's not the person I know. That's a lie. That's stretching the truth. And that's the thing. As soon as people feel like they are being misled by garbage advertising, they tune out and it turns into, all right, I know that is garbage. I'm not supporting it. Now you've just reinforced my belief that I need to vote for the person I kind of was going towards begin with because I knew that they were a good person. Mm-hmm. So a lot of dynamics at play with this. But I mean, I'm hopeful that we can get there. And I know politicians have said it before and, we'll say it again, but, some of the younger crowd that have not had the same social contract that years past have had are going to view things differently. They're being told, hey, trust us, these trickle-down economics are going to work. They're like, hasn't worked in our lifetime. Mm-hmm. Not the way that we've seen. And I think it's going to run afoul of a lot of this. But anyway, I tend to go off on tangents there with hopefully it gives you some insight into, at least where I'm trying to go with some of these things to fix, frankly, the exact problems that you are dealing with today. Because none of you, all things considered equal, you guys would be much rather dealing with your children and your families and not having to wade into politics, which, again, I've seen very militant political women that, for one reason or another, they are relentless in a way that I've not seen men be. So God love you for your work.
Senator Blessing, thank you very much for this very enlightening conversation, for giving us a glimpse into how bipartisanship works in the Ohio Statehouse. We really appreciate your willingness to share your perspectives and to help our audience better understand what collaboration looks like behind the scenes. Conversations like this really help Ohio families look beyond the party labels and better understand how leadership shapes the decisions that affect our everyday lives.
Happy to do it anytime, guys.